we've all heard every single one of the original apostles. There's some sort of horrific martyrdom story associated with them.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have all of these stories, thousands of stories, in fact, but these stories come from decades, centuries, sometimes even a millennium after the events that they supposedly describe. And they've been written by people who weren't present at those events. They've been embellished. So the story about Peter, he was crucified upside down, we're told, because he thought he was unworthy to die like Jesus. It's a great story. Now, the story itself can be dated to the earliest in the 2nd century.
By and large, Christians were not the victims of intense persecution in the early church. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's 2 years between 303 and 305 when the Emperor Diocletian institutes laws that really correspond to what we imagine when we think about persecution. Christians being forced to sacrifice, sort of being hunted down, that the Romans were really going to make sure that they got them. But apart from that brief 2-year period, we really don't see anything much like the modern conception of persecution.
One of the paradoxes that my own research has dealt with is the fact that the evidence that we have, especially for early Christianity, suggests that very few Christians actually experienced persecution. But nevertheless, the story of persecution becomes a kind of framing device for self-understanding and Christian identity. The point is made most singularly by Ignatius of Antioch, a Christian bishop who is under arrest and being escorted to Rome to be executed. As he travels west, he writes letters to various Christian communities, including to the church at Rome, whose members he fears will seek to use their influence or their money to try to extract him from his circumstances. I'm writing to all the churches, and I give injunctions to all people that I am dying for God's sake, if you do not hinder it. I beseech you, be not an unseasonable kindness to me. Suffer me to be eaten by the beasts, through whom I can attain to God. I am God's wheat, and I am ground by the teeth of wild beasts, that I may become the pure bread of Christ. The eager way in which he speaks of the tortures confronting him shows an abnormal mentality, asserts one scholar. Ignatius is, quote, highly strung, even neurotic, claims another, while yet another observes, quote, his language sometimes betrays an exuberance and wildness, which could be interpreted as neurotic. And yet another scholar diagnoses the bishop's state of mind as, quote, exaltation bordering on mania. And yet the passage by Ignatius contains the seeds of the martyrological tradition for future generations of Christians.
It's a major point of reference in contemporary Christianity, particularly Protestant forms of Christianity, that to be truly Christian is to undergo or experience some kind of persecution. There's a sense in which Christians in the West have tended to argue that they're being persecuted. So, for example, the court cases last year that went to the European Court of Human Rights, whereby a woman who was working for British Airways tried to say that she had been persecuted for her beliefs by her employer because she wasn't allowed to wear a crucifix, as part of her uniform for British Airways. They use the language of persecution quite often to describe a feeling of being threatened, of somehow their religious privileges, their religious rights aren't being regarded in the same kind of concrete ways they used to be. Those Christians aren't being persecuted. Christians are being persecuted in Iraq at the moment. Christians are being persecuted in Egypt, for example. That's real persecution. And there are Muslims being persecuted all over the world too. They don't understand how privileged they are in the West. Christianity has been privileged in the West for 2,000 odd years. There are people that really are being persecuted and suffering in the world, not just for their religion, but for their sexuality, for their gender, their ethnicity. Tone it down, Christians, is what I would say.